So I was in the middle of machining the manifold plates and I encountered a problem, which is basically a me problem, and it's that I'm suffering from a good degree of brain fog, and it's one of the reasons that I tend not to film me working, because it interferes with me thinking. I only have so much concentration available, and if I'm trying to think, am I getting this shot, am I explaining this whilst actually working, I make mistakes, or I just stop, have to reset, film again, which is time consuming. So I was doing this little bit of machining, and this is my Harrison L6 long bed, which sits beside my long-term L5. And one thing this lathe doesn't have is a working DRO. The display installed, but I hadn't got around to installing any reader heads on it. And although it does have these very expensive, when new, dual reading conversion dials that display in both metric and imperial, it's a in-feed dial, not a direct reading dial, which means it's moving the movement of the slide, which then of course takes twice that off the diameter. And you know, I'm not doing DRO practice of taking a diameter, putting it in the DRO and then working off the DRO, you know, checking from time to time that everything's tracking. And I just realised the extra mental load was making things a bit difficult, and it was time that I actually fitted the reader head system. And I did this long ago on the L5, which was actually fairly tricky, because the L5 is fitted with this lovely taper turning attachment, which is of the style where the lead screw bearings are in the block that tracks the angle rail, and then the lead screw is driven from the hand wheel by a sliding spline, so you can still put a cut on with a cross slide whilst using the taper turning attachment. And it meant that fitting a conventional scale, and I happen to have one here. I mean, this is not even a slimline one, this was just in the bundle kit I bought for the lathe, and I've never used it because mounting it on the front of the saddle, you're in danger of running up into the chuck. Most people mount it on the back, well then you can't bring the tailstock up tight, so you have to have more overhang on the quill. So my solution was to replace the lead screwed guard with this piece of 6mm or 1/4 inch plate. I had to machine the cross slide a little bit, because the way this is arranged, it has to bolt on from underneath, because this has to sit up high to go inside the taper turning attachment. And then I fitted the reader head through the top cover, and I whilst I was doing other jobs, the piece of brass shim which has been protecting the magnetic encoder strip and has done great service for many years, it was starting to peel up. Cutting oil was affecting the adhesive it was stuck down with, which was just double-sided tape. So I've taken the time to peel that up, clean it, and I'll be using some aluminium tape, which, whilst nowhere near as durable, is much easier to remove and replace when damaged. I made a nice little swarf guard that just drops in there. The old one did actually screw in place, but it's much easier to be able to pull it out without having to go and get tools. It was doing a pretty good job because there wasn't much inside the taper turning attachment. But yeah, some time ago I replaced this reader head. The original was a 5 micron, which of course gives you 10 micron on diameter. So when Machine DRO were having one of their promotions, I bought a 1 micron reader head and have repurposed the 10 micron, the 5 micron, which gives a 10 micron resolution, to this machine. So I've got an adapter plate that bolts on where the taper turning attachment would bolt on, a little angle bracket to mount the reader head. Again, a piece of 6mm 1/4 inch plate, I forget which, I haven't measured it, with a channel for the encoder strip, but the encoder strip on the bottom, this time, because it doesn't have to clear a taper turning attachment, and that sits in here above the lead screw, and I just had to machine out the cover, which can't be used if you've got a taper turning attachment. That would normally protect all your dovetails in here, but I've notched that out to mount, and then I got the big spindle axis encoder, and there's conveniently machined pads for the taper turning attachment guide rail, so getting everything mounted parallel to the ways was really easy. You know, no adjustment needed really, just everything sits planar. And somewhere around here is the plate which drops down to the reader head, and the reader head is on length of M5 studding, and I'll just use nuts to get the spacing right, so that the reader head is under no stress. And that's going to make life very much easier, and this arrangement means you don't have any vulnerable scales that are limiting how close you can get to the chuck or how close the tailstock can come up to the saddle. So I've now got everything in place and buttoned up. Set the clearance between the reader head and the encoder strip. Got the Z-axis encoder head. So in the end I just used a couple of cap head screws, and that screws into the head, and then nuts either side of the plate just hold it the correct distance. You can see the rear cover in place. This could be shorter, but the cable doesn't want to bend at a much tighter radius than that anyway, so if anything it's perhaps a little bit of protection for the cable, so I probably won't bother to cut that down. Coincidentally, the length of magnetic strip I bought was exactly the right length to fit the piece of metal I'd randomly picked off the shelf. But, we look from the other side. And the display, which it has to be said is a very nice display. I mean, this was a very cheap, I think this was an AliExpress purchase, along with the the long encoder and the machine DRO reader head. But yes, this is a really nice display. If I dial into 0, it gives you a change colour when you're very close to 0. If you're doing operations that work towards 0, I was able to go in and set the x-axis into diameter mode, because this is a generic 2-axis display rather than the one that's on the lathe, which in that bottom left hand corner you see it says 2L, and it's a lathe variant. And if it will focus on the axes, you can see they're marked X and Z. The convention on a machine tool being the Z axis is in line with the main spindle. So I've got the X axis for the cross slide, and the Y axis is the long axis in line with the spindle, so that everything is the same as the lathe display. So I'm looking always at the top line when working on diameters, and if people don't like the y-axis being in line with the spindle because you want the x-axis to be left and right, well, feel free to hack the code and change the display for me. I had thought that if I didn't like this, I would go and buy one of the displays that I've got on the mill and the lathe. They're the same manufacturer, but actually I really like the brightness and the clarity of this this LCD display. It also has a calculator function that, like the but unlike the other displays, this one has the ability to do a calculation and then actually enter that value into an axis, which is quite a nice feature that some of the more modern DROs have. So this took overall a couple of days to plan it out, do all the machining, get all the bits together, and yeah, really pleased with the results, and I'll be able to get back to making these manifold plates.